Welcome to part 3 of module 6. We're still looking at developmental psychology. Today what we're going to be talking about is the second portion of infancy and childhood, where we're looking at cognitive development. And this is really going to be where there's a really big chunk of the content from this unit and a lot of focus on it as we kind of walk through these different stages of cognitive development here. So first we want to talk a little bit about Jean Piaget. Piaget is a very, very important psychologist. He is one that they will expect you to know on the AP Psychology test, and he comes up all the time. So Piaget was a developmental psychologist, which probably makes sense considering the unit we're talking about here. But initially, he developed children's intelligence tests. We talked about some forms of intelligence tests. Obviously, if we're going to test a child, it's going to need to look different than if we're going to test an adult. So he started off his career developing those kinds of tests. But eventually, he started to focus on the differences in thinking between adults and children, right? Obviously, those things are pretty connected. But he started to look at the differences of how they actually think. Now, before Piaget, the kind of common assumption in psychology and really in general at the time was that children were basically just less intelligent or less competent, as it says there, adults. So if you look back, like even kind of a long time ago before there were cameras and things like that, right? If you look at young kids, a lot of times they are dressed like adults, they're treated like adults. This is one of the reasons why we could have had things like child labor, because they just said these are just small adults. They just aren't as good at things yet as adults are. But Piaget actually, through his research, showed that children actually think differently than adults do. And again, we're going to kind of walk through this. So and we talked a little bit about the biological basis of this and why this happens, but the way that they think about things is actually completely different than an adult is. It's not just that they are less intelligent, but they're actually solving problems in a different way. So first we have to talk a little bit about kind of the general ideas that we're going to be seeing. So Piaget's core idea is that our intellectual progression reflects the struggle to make sense of our experiences. So again, everything we see, and we'll kind of get to see this when we look at his different stages, basically each one is going to be explaining the world. And if you look at the behavior of kids in those age groups, you can kind of see how this explanation of the world would shape their thinking. Now, we also want to remind ourselves of what a schema is. We may have mentioned it a little bit in cognition, but a schema is a concept or framework that organizes and interprets information. So children form schemas as they experience new situations as events. Again, a schema is this kind of way of organizing things, this way of interpreting information. So like a really simple example I can give you that we've kind of talked about a little bit is an example of a schema might be a concept, like something like a dog or a cat, and we'll kind of have this organization of what these different things are, what makes one a dog, what makes one a cat, and all these kind of varieties. Now, to add on to that, right, some of the important things we're going to see are assimilation and accommodation, and these go right along with schemas. So we start to build these schemas as we go through life, right? Obviously starting as, really even as newborns, and as we go through life, we start to build these schemas. Now what's going to happen is as we build the schemas, we're going to use assimilation and accommodation to kind of change those and manipulate them to make them better fit reality. So assimilation, for example, is interpreting our new experience in terms of our existing schemas. So for example, if I'm a really young kid, you may have seen this before, even if you spend a lot of time with young children, or if you have any young siblings, if you teach them certain animals, right? So usually they learn like farm animals right away. So they might learn like doggy or kitty or what a cow is maybe. And you take that kid and you go for a walk and you see an animal. So maybe you have a cat in your house, for example. Maybe you have a cat and you go, oh, this is a kitty. And you go for a walk and there's a dog walking down the street. It wouldn't be unusual for that young child to point to that dog and say kitty. Because what they're doing is they're using assimilation. They're looking at something that seems similar to something they already know, and they're adding it in, right? They're interpreting that animal to mean something that they already understand, this kitty. Okay, this is actually exactly what we see in the movie Monsters Inc., right? Boo always calls Sully Kitty because, again, she obviously knows what a kitty is, so she looks at him and she sees, a furry animal with a tail, and says, oh, that must be a kitty. Now, accommodation is basically what's going to be happening probably immediately after if that happens. So accommodation is where we are adapting our current understandings or schemas to incorporate new information. So you have that experience, the little kid, points at the dog and says, oh, kitty, and you would correct them, right? You say, oh, no, that's a doggy, right? That's a dog or a puppy. And so what happens is over time, after you might have to do that a few times, or maybe they see a dog on TV or whatever, but after a few times, they learn, oh, this is a dog or a puppy or a doggy or whatever, and this is a cat or a kitty or whatever they call it, right? And they learn that there's a separation. And so that's why eventually, right, as kids get older and older, they're able to tell the difference, right? They're able to look at, and say, that's a dog and that's a cat, right? And we're kind of interpreting these. One thing I think it's really important to add too is that these are kind of very complex things that are going on. I think we talked about it a little bit before again in cognition, but even right now, if I asked you to kind of define the differences or define what a dog is, right? Like, what are the traits that have to be there for it to be a dog? And what are the traits that have to be there for it to be a cat? It's probably really hard, right? Because you can't say, it has to have 4 legs, because a dog or a cat could have less than 4 legs and it would still be a dog or a cat, right? You couldn't say it has to have hair, because some don't have hair. It doesn't have to have a tail, right? There's all these kind of different things. So these schemas become very, very complex over time. And so as we get older, we basically are constantly assimilating and accommodating, right? Either adding new things to this category, taking things and maybe separating a category into multiple groups, and we're adding and expanding throughout our entire lives. So this is all the basis of a lot of what Piaget is going to say is happening. So that's going to take us to our first stage here. So our first stage of Piaget, or Piaget's first stage of development, is what is called the sensorimotor stage. Sensorimotor stage. So the sensorimotor stage runs from birth to about age 2. Now, we're always going to put age limits on here. Technically, right, there isn't a technical, perfect line that has to be cut off, but in general, this is what those ages would look like. So from birth to age 2, we're in this sensorimotor stage. And in this stage, this is obviously infants. Infants are going to use their senses and motor abilities to learn about the world around them. Now, again, these stages are all about explaining the world to Piaget. So he looks at the behavior of babies, of infants, of these really, really young children, and he says, okay, how do they understand the world? Well, infants understand the world through their senses, right? If you've ever been around, a child in between, a newborn and 2 years old, what are they doing? They're looking around at everything. They stare at you, right? If you've ever held a baby, the baby just stares at you, or it looks around maybe. It listens to things. It wants to touch things. Another really good example is, what's one thing that you always have to pay attention to children for, or babies for, is they're going to put things in their mouth, right? They want to grab it and they put it in their mouth. All of those are senses they're using, right? They're trying to get as much sensory information as possible to learn about what's going on around them. Another piece that we see inside the sensorimotor stage is what is called object permanence. So object permanence is actually going to happen kind of in the middle-ish of sensorimotor stage. They're going to gain object permanence. So object permanence is the awareness that things continue to exist even when no longer perceived. So for example, if you're sitting in your living room and your mom walks by you and walks into a different room, you know that your mom is still there, right? You know she's still in existence, even though you can't see her, you maybe can't hear her or whatever. That's object permanence. Now, up until about 10 months old, right, infants don't have object permanence. They actually, if they can't see or hear something, it doesn't exist. So this is why, peekaboo is such a fun game for little kids, right? So you, cover up your face, and then you, appear again. So as an adult, right, if someone did that to you, you would look at them like they were, an idiot. You'd be like, what are you doing? That doesn't make any sense. But for an infant, what's actually happening is you're literally disappearing from existence and then literally reappearing, right? Literally disappearing and literally reappearing over and over again. So it's like actual magic to them. And again, it's all about just the difference in how our brain is functioning, how our cognition is working. So that's sensorimotor stage. Our next stage is the pre-operational stage. So the pre-operational stage goes from about age 2 to about 6 or 7 years old. Again, obviously, these boundaries are all kind of gray areas depending on the child, but about 6 or 7 years old. Now, during this time period, we're going to see children learn to use language, but they do not yet comprehend mental operations of what's called concrete logic. So we'll get into that in just a second. We'll actually see that in the next stage, what this is kind of referring to. But they're going to start using language, right? So children start to talk from about 2 to 6, but they aren't able to do things in their head, right? So like, for example, they can like watch you maybe like pour glasses into things. They can watch you move things around. They can, maybe figure out really, really basic kind of like problems. I guess you could say like basic problem solving if they can see it happening. But what they can't do is they can't do it in their head, right? So if I ask them to like solve a problem, but they aren't able to like physically do it or physically see it, they're not able to solve that problem. They don't have the ability to use mental operations. Now, there's a difference between concrete logic and abstract logic that we'll get to in just a little bit, but this is kind of that first piece. Now, one of the big things that's happening as well in the pre-operational stage is we're seeing an increase in their mental representation of objects. One of the really big ways that we see this is make-believe. Right? Children from 2 to 6 or 7 years old are going to play a lot of make-believe. And they're kind of like almost stretching these muscles, you can think of it that way, of your brain, where you're practicing using these mental representations. You're pretending to take on roles. You're playing as different things. You might imagine, even imaginary friends are a good example of this. We are building these mental representations. So we're going to see that start to happen from ages 2 to about 6 or 7. From there, we're going to move into the, I'm sorry, this is still pre-operational stage. I thought we were going to move on to the next one already. So pre-operational stage, this is another piece here. Now, one of the big things in the pre-operational stage is conservation. Now, what's important here is that in the pre-operational stage, children are not able to use conservation, okay? This is a little tricky the way it's phrased, but I think it's the only way it kind of makes sense to do it here. So conservation is not going to be happening in this pre-operational stage, okay? It will be available in the next stage, but it won't be there until then. So what is conservation? So conservation is the principle that properties such as things like mass, volume, or the amount or number remain the same despite what are called changes in the form of objects. So we're going to look at some examples in class. We'll watch these 2 videos that are here. But in general, I can give you an example, right? Let's look at just this video right here. The basic idea is I've got 2 glasses of this blue liquid, right? Now, let's start off and say that both of the glasses look exactly like this. You can see the empty one right here. It's actually already poured. So we've got 2 glasses that have the exact same amount of liquid in them, okay? You look at them and you say, all right, look at these 2 glasses. Does one of them have more? And the kid's going to look at them and say, no, they look the same. Then what you can do is you can take one of those glasses and pour it into a taller glass or a shorter, fatter glass or whatever. A glass is a different size. In this case, it's a taller one. So you can see now we've got one short one and one tall one. Now again, the child saw you pour the liquid from the glass into the tall glass. So an adult, if you ask this question, or anybody who has the ability to use conservation, would look at that and go, if you asked, all right, which one has more, you would say they're the same, right? Because they were the same before. I just saw you pour it in. It's the same amount of liquid. It's just a different shape. If you ask a child who's in the pre-operational stage that exact same question, they'll say the taller one has more. Because when they look at it, they're going to see that it's taller. And to them, taller is more. That's conservation. So in the pre-operational stage, they do not have conservation. If I change the form of something, they assume it changes like the amount or the volume or the number. Once I get into what's called the concrete stage, which is our next one, we'll gain the ability to use conservation, and we know we'll be able to solve those problems. Okay, so we'll kind of see that, like I said, in these videos that we watch during class, you'll get to see these differences and how our thinking changes. Hold on, I gotta move myself a little bit. Let's go right here. Okay. Now, continuing, right, we still have even more in this pre-operational stage. So there's a lot going on in this stage. Another thing that we're going to see in the pre-operational stage is what is called egocentrism. Egocentrism is the difficulty of a child in the pre-operational stage to develop, of development to take on another's point of view. Pretty much exactly what you kind of would think of if you know what egocentrism is, right? This idea that I am unable to see from someone else's perspective. So, and this is again really, really common. If you talk to a little kid, you'll understand this, right? So let's actually talk about theory of mind because it's very closely connected. So theory of mind says people's ideas about their own and others' mental states, i.e. their feelings, perceptions, and thoughts, and the behaviors these might predict. So these are very closely connected. It's just kind of an additional step. So egocentrism, again, is this idea that you're unable to look from your own perspective. So if we want to use kind of like a specific example, we can use that kind of, looks kind of like a comic going down the right side here. So this is a basic example that we could use. We could show a child in the pre-operational stage this. So there's Sally, right, and there's Anne. You know, these are two different people. So Sally has a ball. She puts the ball in the basket. Okay, Sally goes out for a walk and then takes the ball out of the basket and puts it in the box. So now Sally comes back and she wants to play with the ball. Where will Sally look? Now again, a child would look at this and they would say in the box. And the reason they would say in the box is because they are looking from their perspective. They know that Anne moved the ball. But the reality is Sally would actually look in the basket because the last place that she saw it was in the basket and she was gone. So this is like a concrete example, like a test you could use to test egocentrism, this idea. And again, now we can see this in little kids, even if you've just talked to them. So for example, like if you ask a little kid, you know, what's their favorite animal? And then you say, well, what's my favorite animal? They'll probably say the exact same thing if they're in this pre-operational stage because they aren't able to comprehend that you would have a different perspective. They are going to assume that their favorite animal is everyone's favorite animal. Their favorite food is everyone's favorite food. That if they don't like something, everyone likes something. And again, this gets into this kind of theory of mind, right? That we, at this point, children have a lot of trouble basically being able to understand the feelings, perceptions, and thoughts of other people. Now, eventually that will develop, but at this age group during this pre-operational stage, they're not very good at it. This is also why you might see, like, if you look at kids that are this age, this is like first, second, and kindergarten kind of age groups at the end. You can see that maybe they're playing outside, and one kid might run over and push a kid down and take their toy, right? And you always like see like the teacher or the mom will come over and be like, "Well, why'd you do that?" And they'd be like, "I wanted to play with the toy." And then your mom has to, the mom has to go, "Well, what about them? They might want to play with the toy," right? And what's happening is that kid never even thought about that, right? They knew that they wanted to play with the toy, and that's all that mattered in the moment. An additional piece that we can kind of add on here is we actually see children with autism have an impaired theory of mind. So one of the things that we see with autism is this struggle to understand other people's emotions. And this is basically where that comes from. Now, it doesn't necessarily have to happen in this age group, but in general, a child without autism or without any disabilities or anything would basically develop this theory of mind, grow out of egocentrism, at least to some level, and be able to look at another human being, see their emotions, and understand their emotions. Children with autism basically aren't able to do that. They aren't able to develop or at least not very well, this theory of mind. And that's why there's a lot of the social problems that we see with children and adults with autism, or people with autism. So that's going to get us finally to our next stage. Hold on, let me move myself here. All right. So that's going to get us to our next stage, which is the concrete operational stage. So again, the last 3 slides were all pre-operational. Pre-operational comes right before concrete operational. So the concrete operational stage goes from about age 6 or 7, right where pre-operational leaves off, to about 11 years old. So you can think of it pretty much like the kind of elementary school, right? To the middle towards the end of elementary school-ish. Now, during this time, children gain the mental operations that enable them to think logically about concrete events. So one of the big ones is conservation. So during this age, we'll basically see them develop this ability to use conservation like we talked about before with the liquid. Another example you can see right here, right, where if a kid always seems to like get sick or sneeze when the cat is around, they'll realize, oh, I am sneezing because of the cat. I must be allergic to cats, right? It's a concrete, real life thing that they are able to basically think about and make logical kind of jumps or solutions to. We're also going to see what's called reversibility. So reversibility is pretty much exactly what it sounds like, the ability that recognize that numbers or objects can be changed and returned to their original condition. So for example, if I pour that liquid into the tall glass, they would be able to understand that I could take that liquid and pour it back into the short glass and it would be exactly the same. Or if I did a math problem, so maybe I did 2 times 2, right? So I know that 2 times 2 equals 4. We would also know that if I, divide that, it's the opposite, right? If I do 4 divided by 2, it's going to be 2, right? So they're going to be able to basically do and undo. That's the idea of reversibility. One thing that's really important and pretty apparent in the name is these are concrete operations. These are things that are happening in real life or that we can actually do or see or manipulate. These are not abstract. They are concrete. That gets us to the formal operational stage. The formal operational stage. So the formal operational stage begins at about age 12. This is the final stage of Piaget's stages of development, cognitive development. So it begins about age 12. Now, what we're going to see here is basically we'll see the beginning of people thinking logically about abstract concepts. So concrete operational takes us through those concrete logical basically ways of thinking or problem solving or whatever. Once we get to formal operational, we'll now be able to think logically about abstract concepts. So just to read that second part, our reasoning expands from the purely concrete involving actual experience to encompass abstract thinking involving imagined realities and symbols. So now we can imagine things that aren't actually real or wouldn't actually happen, and it'll make sense. So the example we'll see eventually in class in this in the video on here is basically they're going to give a child a made-up scenario, right? They're going to kind of set a rule, like an imaginary rule, and then they're going to ask a child, what would happen. And what the child is going to do if they're not in the formal operational stage, so I believe this kid would be in the concrete operational, is they're going to answer as if it's the real world. They're not going to follow the imaginary rules because they can't. They're not able to do that yet. But a child in the formal operational stage, right, so someone who's over the age of 12 generally, will be able to think about the imaginary rules of that world and apply them and understand that, okay, that's what happens in this world. Even though this wouldn't happen in reality, this is what that means in this abstract kind of thought experiment. You can kind of think of it that way. So we're basically taking the step from, again, concrete to abstract thinking. That's the most important part of formal operational. So that's going to get us to Piaget's legacy. I'll get you out of the way so you can see him. So Piaget's legacy. Now, again, Piaget, incredibly influential. It says, although Piaget's observation and stage theories are useful, today's researchers have a few different beliefs. So one of the things we talked about at the very beginning was this idea of kind of like, you can think of it like stair-step development, where we basically reach an age and then suddenly we're able to do something, and then we go on and then we reach an age. And it's moved towards what is called a continuous process. So instead of believing that there's like this magical cutoff at 2 years old and then magically you're able to think a different way, today psychologists believe it's more of kind of a continuous growth, that you slowly are building your way towards these different things, whether it be egocentrism or theory of mind or concrete problems or abstract problems, that we're basically slowly, continuously growing there. We also see that children show some mental abilities and operations at an age earlier than Piaget thought. So we actually believe that some of these are a little bit off, that they're actually happening earlier on than Piaget was going to originally say in his theories. And the last part is that Piaget really focused on formal logic. As you could probably tell, pretty much all of the things he was looking at were how do you solve problems. But today, when we look at, or psychologists look at, cognition in general, they actually believe that this idea of logic or formal logic is a much smaller part of cognition than we originally thought it was. And this is just mainly a shift really in psychology in general. Before, they believed that formal logic was a really important part of cognition, and today it's still important, but it's not necessarily as important. It's a smaller piece that goes into a kind of much bigger puzzle. Now, let's look at a little bit of kind of an addition. So, and this is an alternative, but it's kind of something that's going to develop later on, or a different way of looking at these kind of developments or these theories about how children learn. So this is from Lev Vygotsky. So Vygotsky is another, again, psychologist. He develops a theory of how how the child's mind grows through interaction with the social environment. So again, you may have noticed in Piaget's there really wasn't any kind of social things going on. It was just basically that at a certain age, you basically are able to do new things or different things. Vygotsky is going to look more at a social connection, that there's an interaction going on between the child and their environment, and that's going to cause differences in how they develop and how their mind grows. One of the quotes, "Children learn best by interacting with others." So one of the ways we see this is what is called scaffolding. Scaffolding is the process in which a more skilled learner gives help to a less skilled learner, reducing the amount of help as the less skilled learner becomes more and more capable. So scaffolding is something that is incredibly important in teaching. So you've actually experienced scaffolding a million times, even from non-teachers, but you've experienced it all the time from teachers as a way that we learn. The basic idea is this, and I'm going to use the example of riding a bike. So the basic idea is when you first learn to ride a bike, your parents probably get you a tricycle or a bike with training wheels on it, something similar. And at first, they're going to stand there and they're going to hold you, right? And you're going to go really slow, and you're just going to kind of practice like sitting there. And obviously, like, you can't fall off because there's training wheels, so you kind of teeter around and you basically just practice. And you do that for a while, right? And you get better and better at it. You learn how to turn, you learn how to stop, right? They might teach you, they might help you. The first time they don't just, push you down the road and say, all right, good luck, right? You practice all these different things. Now, once they've done that, eventually what's going to happen is they're going to take those training wheels off. Now, most likely what happens, they probably don't take the training wheels off, get you on the bike, shove you down a hill and say good luck. What they're going to do is they're going to take the training wheels off, right? And they might stand next to you. They might hold on to the bike or the seat or something as you kind of practice. And eventually they're going to, maybe they kind of let go, but they guide there. They're there to catch you. And you slowly practice, right? Until eventually you're just able to ride the bike on your own. That's scaffolding, right? We're giving a more skilled learner is giving you assistance, and they're slowly taking away that assistance over time. And as they reduce that amount of help, you get better and better and better at it.